Hello everybody, thank you for joining me. For those of you who are new here, my name is Rowan Garlow. I'm a trauma recovery practitioner, and today we're talking about the highly sensitive person or a person with sensory processing sensitivity. And I'm really excited because there's so much to uncover in this video. First of all, let's just define what a highly sensitive person is. This is a person who requires less stimuli to create an internal response to something that's happening. So their system is going to respond more actively than a person without this highly sensitive system. And what's interesting is that about 15 to 20% of the population has this. This is an innate, biologically wired trait. So this is not something that you can heal a person out of, but this is absolutely just fundamental to the way that these individuals process information. And when we talk about how we process information, it's so important to look at the ways in which the human race is very neurodiverse. And there's a lot of sort of overlapping words that get thrown in when we talk about the highly sensitive person. And that's things like introversion, because there's an overlap. About 70%, based on the research, about 70% of people who are introverts identify as being highly sensitive people. And about 30% of people who are highly sensitive identify as being extroverts. So there is certainly a large enough correlation between introversion and highly sensitive persons to mention, however, not necessarily the case with every person. So there's definitely people who are sensory processing sensitivity people, and yet they're very extroverted. Some of that will have to do with the way that a person was raised. So we know that if a person has a sensitive system and they're given this really nurturing environment, then the way that they're going to be open to the world is going to be very different than a person who has a sensitive system and was highly stimulated and potentially traumatized. When we talk about HSP, another thing that comes up along with introversion is things like PTSD. And it's different than PTSD because, again, it's an innate trait. PTSD is something that can be healed. However, we do see a co-occurrence happening with PTSD because of how sensitive a person's system is, right? If it's a more sensitive system and you introduce a traumatizing stimulus, then it potentially is going to be more traumatizing for that person, or just traumatizing in a way that maybe it wouldn't be for someone else. So that's another important thing to mention. So these things absolutely co-occur and can end up maybe compounding each other with the law of attraction and the way that we know trauma works, and we try to recreate that circumstance at a biological level to work our way through it. So one of the things that highly sensitive people will potentially have to do is to look at the ways in which their sensitivity was treated in childhood. Because as I've talked about in other videos, the way that you're treated is how we end up treating ourselves. So our external family system becomes our internal family system. And so if we were shamed or we were not understood, then that might have created some internal polarity or some internal problems or issues. For example, you could end up shaming yourself, or you could end up lining up with people that don't really understand what's happening with you or really unable to see you for where you're at because of those previous experiences. However, it's important to note that the sensitive system is not necessarily the traumatized system. And so it's important to also note that while those things definitely happen, and you know my opinion on this if you followed me long enough, I don't really think it's possible to be a human being walking around right now and not have trauma. But it's just to say that highly sensitive people could have, a lower degree of that and still have a highly sensitive system. So another thing that oftentimes gets linked with HSPs is neuroticism or anxiety and depression. And this makes a lot of sense at just a fundamental level, because if a person has a more sensitive system, then potentially more anxiety is going to get provoked. And when I go into the evolution and the brain research that we understand, it says a lot about maybe why some of that depression might also be there. And we need to look at, how is this treated in the family home, like I was talking about before, because if a person is being pushed away because of this, well, that could potentially lead to depression because they've had to split off from themselves. So there's a lot of things to look at here. Another thing that comes up when we talk about HSPs is potentially things like autism spectrum disorder or other sensory processing disorders. And it is distinctly different because autism spectrum disorder comes along with other difficulties in social processing. There's also other difficulties that come along with the ability to like function day to day in autism spectrum in the way that HSPs may to some degree also go through, but it's a very different way of processing. So I don't know all of the exact neuroscience behind how it's exactly different, but they are distinct. However, that's not to say, again, that there's not overlap between being a highly sensitive person, having those characteristics and also having autism spectrum disorder. So the same way that PTSD and HSP, right, things start to get a little blurry after a while, but they are distinct. And so some biologists view this trait as an innate strategy, like that we sort of go one of two ways. We're either the system who is acting quickly, or we're the system who's observing carefully and then acting. And obviously people who are in the HSP category are going to be the observing before acting. And if you think about this from an evolutionary perspective, you can see how it would be really beneficial for maybe a large percentage of the herd or the group to be able to respond very quickly, and to also have maybe a smaller percentage of the population or the group who's able to observe more keenly details in things that the quick responders may miss. And so there's, like I was saying at the beginning, about 15 to 20% of the population identifies as HSP or has this innate quality, and it's also found in all these other species. So we know that we're evolutionarily adapted to actually have this, because we need a percentage of our population to have this level of sensitivity, and we needed it back then for really being able to hone in on details about food, about shelter, mates, micro things happening within social structures and communications, really picking up on subtle bodies in the way that the other portion of the group may not. And so before I go too much into the evolutionary science part of it, I really want to touch on how important I think it is that for our evolution, we start to celebrate and understand the degree of neurodiversity that's happening within the human race. We're so used to seeing life through our one perspective that we often don't understand that other people are processing through their 5 senses, through their 10 senses, through their energy bodies, through all these different ways in such unique and distinct ways from one another. And it's all necessary as part of, being these sponges who are soaking up these experiences and understanding who we are and what we are. We need this diversity. But when we understand that level of the neurodiversity and processing, it greatly affects and shifts and changes how we educate people, how we have relationships, how we build a society, how we structure basically everything. So I think that's a really important and will continue to be a very important development in human consciousness. So I'm super excited to talk about some of the science, but I want to give you a better idea too about what are some of these traits, because the science makes a lot more of an impact, or it makes more sense if we understand, what are the traits that are evolutionarily beneficial and why are they beneficial. So first of all, there's 3 different main categories that a person can be sensitive in. We can be sensitive with ourselves, the way that we perceive ourselves, the way that we perceive our body in time and space, the way that we perceive our emotional body, the way that we perceive our thoughts. We may be very, very in tune with all the little workings of what's happening here. We may be sensitive to other people and everything that's happening with them, all the subtleties that's happening there within the context of a relationship. And we might be very sensitive in our environment, so to smells, to textures, to locations, temperatures, energies of a room, of a space. And again, because we're talking about neurodiversity, the level to which that sensitivity is happening may vary from person to person. So let's talk about the traits. One of the acronyms that I heard that was really helpful is the acronym DOES. So D stands for depth of processing, meaning that people who are HSPs, they are processing at a very deep level. Part of this has to do with why they get so tired so easily, and there's actual research to back up what kind of activation is happening in their system or in their brains versus somebody who doesn't have a highly sensitive system, and how much more quickly that could maybe exhaust the system's resources. So there's a very deep level of processing happening. The O stands for overstimulation, which obviously, if you have a sensitive system, it is more prone to being overly stimulated, which is why self-care practices like really consciously taking out time to decompress are absolutely so important, which we're going to talk about at the end. So the E stands for emotional reactivity. And this is noted by the person's, again, their response, their heightened response to a stimuli. It doesn't take very much stimulus to create a response. And the responses that they do have are going to be very big. This could be very positive too. And this could be, experiencing a more negative emotion to a more extreme degree, or a thought or a feeling or whatever. But again, that also means that you have access to super amazing levels of connection and because of how intensely an HSP is feeling. And the S stands for sensing the subtleties. So this goes back to that really detail-oriented depth of processing, really sensing the subtleties of a situation that maybe somebody else would not. These individuals tend to be highly intuitive and oftentimes very empathic. And there's also research to support that the level of empathy that's happening within an HSP at a neurological level is actually higher. The parts of the brain that are activated when looking at photos, kind of creeping into the research part of this, when looking at photos in an fMRI, a functional MRI, magnetic resonance instrument, I think that's what it is, where they can look at your brain and they would show them images of loved ones and of strangers feeling happy or feeling sad. And what they found was that people with HSP, the parts of their brain that were lighting up, especially with the loved ones or people that they knew when they were happy or sad, the mirror neuron system that was happening at a much more extreme degree. So that feeling of like, oh yeah, I really can feel you, that's really happening. But it's also important to notice that the level of empathy that a highly sensitive person has may differ because of what they're sensitive to. So if they're just specifically, more sensitive to their environment, then they may not have that same level of connection to the empathizing with another person, for example. Neurodiversity. A lot of times people with HSP, they prefer to exercise alone because they don't like feeling like people are watching them. So they might do things like bicycling or something that can get them away and alone. Oftentimes, it's harder for HSPs to make decisions because of how much processing goes into making a decision. They're thinking about all the possible outcomes. I can think about times where I've been standing in a grocery store and really overwhelmed with the amount of different prices and different ingredients and where do I, and then you add some sort of feeling of maybe a time crunch. That's another thing, is that time pressures can feel very, very extreme and just overwhelming. And so you add choices with time and can be overstimulating for that system. So sometimes it can take a little bit longer to make choices, but perhaps that person making that choice is really thinking it through. And so I want to sort of continue to spin all of this in a very positive light, because we have a tendency to see the word sensitive, especially in the Western world, as a negative thing. And, sort of weaving in the cultural piece here, the way that a culture is responding to that sensitivity has a lot to do with the outcome of the person who has that sensitivity. So this is an innate trait. It's absolutely required for our evolution, and we need to be celebrating this. So again, with the decisions, might take you a long time, but you're really thinking it through. HSPs are people who are really prone to reading between the lines, seeing the subtleties. They will see that little crack in the lamp. They will see that little hole in the wall, and it will drive them crazy because they are absolutely tuned in to what's happening in their environment, if that's the way that their sensitivity is showing up. These people usually avoid things like horror movies or violent movies because of the mirror neuron quality. Again, when watching that, there's a resonance in their system that can literally pick up and feel what that would feel like, because the brain oftentimes isn't able to recognize the difference between what's happening with somebody else and maybe what's happening with me. It could be too overwhelming for their system to see that kind of violence. And another thing that I thought was really interesting is that HSPs are really great at working in teams. So even though they like to exercise alone, they're really good at working with other people because they can analyze other people's strengths really well, and they know where to put people in a team and can actually be really great leaders. Even though a lot of them are introverts, the extroverted ones who want to be in leader roles have a really great ability to organize teams like that. So there's 6 types of highly sensitive people, which I think it's interesting that they decided to break it up into those 6 different types, because I can see a person really actually having all of these types in them. But for the sake of this, I'm just going to go through them briefly, because it's also possible that a person's like dominant in 1 or 2 of these, and it's just kind of fun to learn about. So the first type of highly sensitive person is the psychomotor person. This person has a lot of extra energy. They probably enjoy extreme activities. They love talking. They sometimes could, veer towards being overly competitive, maybe workaholics, or even have some substance abuse. And they just overall find it difficult to stand still. The next type is the highly sensitive sensual person. So this person kind of sees the world in a very dreamy way. They have, heightened senses. So food is really an event for them, maybe, or music is just so captivating for their soul. This person might have been a picky eater when they were younger. They might have a tendency to overindulge as an adult in different kinds of luxurious things that really feed the senses. But, again, just talking about the positives of just the first 2 that we've gone through, like, wow, what a way to be. What a, we could all use a dose of this sensual embodiment of life, of really just, eating and really breathing. And I don't know, it sounds great to me. And even the psychomotor, like, who doesn't love a little extra energy, a little bit of chat, a little bing. Let's go to the next one. The next one is the intellectual. The intellectual is the person, they're asking a bunch of questions. They definitely recall information in really vivid detail, and they're really observing other people. They are seekers in life. And, some of the ways that this could negatively manifest is that maybe they are overly critical of themselves or other people. They might just be so wrapped up in their logic that they're sort of missing some of that dreaminess. Next, we have the imaginational, which I didn't even know that was a word. That was the first time I ever heard that word. Bet you never heard that word. These are the people who have like notebooks just filled with doodles and drawings, very creative people. They have very vivid dreams, and sometimes things don't feel real to them. So they maybe daydream a lot, and they maybe have a hard time distinguishing the difference between what's fantasy, what's reality. They just really don't like boring things. And I don't know about you, but I don't really like boring things either. So I can definitely relate to this type. But it is good to, be able to distinguish the difference between what's happening here, what's happening there. But, in reality, maybe it is all just a dream. So maybe people who are processing this way are fucking spot on. Then we have the Orchid Child, or the person who, as this child, was really sensitive to the context that they're in. And if nourished properly, like I was saying before, it can really flourish. But again, I think that's kind of everyone. I think we're all our own little Orchid Child. And if we are given the right amount of water and sunshine, we can, flourish and develop through the stages. The last type is the emotional type, which is where you really see the sensitivity coming in through the emotional sphere. So these people might be very honest, they might be very raw, they might really be able to feel other people, connect very deeply with other people emotionally. And what I thought was interesting about this type was it a lot of times comes through in very physical ways. So sweaty palms, palpitations, upset stomach, blushing. So it makes a lot of sense. Our body is responding to the emotional stimulus and everything else that's happening. Now, my friends, if you've made it this far, we are at the point where we talk about this very interesting study that I wanted to share with you. So first of all, there's science that backs up and proves that an HSP individual is going to be observing a situation before and planning before they take action. And this is shown by the brain scans that show activation in the parts of the brain responsible for action planning. Two different things I want to touch on. I'm going to pop up a picture of a brain here and just want to show you. So the cingulate here and the insula, all parts of the brain that are responsible for awareness, integration of memory, empathy, and action planning were all shown to be activated in people with HSP who were shown happy or sad photos of loved ones. So there was increased brain activation in these parts of the brain in a way that they were not activated in people with non-HSP systems. So let's talk about a little bit of the science, how they're, saying a person has HSP within these different studies, because they're using HSP people to study them, independently of, let's say, a normal system. And so there's a questionnaire that's been created by Dr. Aaron, the person in the early 90s who created this term and was really coming in through this research about highly sensitive persons and how they're neurologically different. And so how they're, labeling a person as HSP is through this questionnaire, which is called the Highly Sensitive Person Scale. And so based on that questionnaire, then they're saying, okay, these are the people that we're going to study as having HSP. So I just want to clarify that when we talk about these different studies and who they're putting in these brain imaging machines and where are they getting this information from. So we know that with tasks, there's increased brain activation in the parts of the brain that are associated with action planning. So as I was talking about earlier, that observing before acting thing, that those two different strategies for processing information, well, this is what we're talking about. This is showing that the brain is literally more activated in action planning than actually the action in that moment. So what we know is that HSPs are actually better at memory retention. And part of this has to do with the way that their brain uses dopamine and serotonin. There's actually lower levels of serotonin found in HSPs. And lower levels of serotonin are also associated with improved memory of learned material, better decision making, better mental functioning, and gaining more positive mental health than others from positive life experiences. This lower serotonin, which at first you say, oh my God, lower serotonin, is that why I'm depressed? Shit, like I want more serotonin. But it's actually serving for the organism to have that high level of processing. And so researchers are looking at all the gene variations that affect how much dopamine is available to the brain. And these different genetic variations are what are pointing to this being an inherited trait. So when we talk about dopamine and how much dopamine is or isn't available to the brain, or there being lower serotonin levels, we know we're looking at HSPs being less driven by external reward. So their brain is basically not going to give them the same level of dopamine dump that you might get when you think about going to that super exciting party, because their system's not wired to do that. That's not success for them. So they've actually conserved those kinds of dopamine dumps or serotonin dumps for other things. So they're a lot less driven by those external rewards, because sometimes those external rewards have cost them their nervous system regulation. So it's caused them to go into overstimulation, which is not beneficial. So then the system will wire to not be as driven by the external rewards. Quite interesting. So another fun piece of information is that we see an increased activity in the ventromedial prefrontal cortex in individuals with HSP. And so what that means is that they have a really vivid internal emotional landscape. So basically that's just science pointing to the fact that you have a whole world inside of you emotionally. and it's really vivid, and that's a really beautiful thing. Another thing is that, when I was talking about these mirror neurons, so it's not necessarily that HSPs have more mirror neurons, it's just that they're more active. So the mirror neurons that might just lay dormant in another person are like, meh, 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 in response to that violent movie or something that happens with a loved one. They can really feel it. Okay, so this next piece of information is really interesting because there's a couple different parts of it that I didn't even really know about, and it just really showcases how HSPs are processing information differently. So my phone died, and that's where we're at with this. So we're just going to redo that part about the study, and I took my hair tie out because it was giving me a fucking headache. Okay, so let me tell you about this study. Basically, at the very, when you whittle it all down, the meat of the study is talking about how normally between East Asians and European Americans, there is a difference to how information is processed. Obviously, how a person identifies with their culture affects this. So if a East Asian person doesn't identify as being East Asian culturally, then this doesn't apply to them. But we're talking about people who identify heavily with their culture. The East Asian person is going to find tasks that have to do with being contextually dependent or relative easier. And the European American is going to find contextually independent or absolute tasks easier. So their brains respond preferentially to those tasks, which makes sense when you look at the two different cultures, one valuing, independence, the American culture, and the Asian culture valuing interdependence, meaning that the individual is oftentimes valued over the group, whether we would like to believe it or not. That's kind of what's happening. It's like every man out for himself in the Western world. And then in Asia or in East Asian culture, for example, we have the value being placed on the group or on interdependence, meaning that the individual would sacrifice themselves for the greater good of the whole. And so what's interesting is that with HSPs, it sort of like gets rid of this cultural difference that would normally happen. So when they did the same study with HSPs versus non-HSPs with the same cultural differences, HSPs scored low in the cultural difference, meaning that their brain actually responded with a lot lower cultural bias to the task. So the way that their brain was processing, naturally that innate quality of processing overrode what cultural bias or what cultural normal mode of processing would be there, which is interesting. And I'm going to put up a photo here of the study, and it's interesting because this is what they had them do. So for the relative instructions, they had the participants judge if the box and line combination matched the proportional scaling of the combination before it, so of the box before it. And then in the absolute instructions, the participants had to judge whether each line matched the previous line, regardless of the size that was accompanying, regardless of the size of the box. Basically, the Americans naturally would have been better at doing the absolute instructions where they were just judging the line and matching it with the previous line regardless of the accompanying box, and the East Asian individuals would have found it easier to do the first one, which is the relative instructions, where each box and line combination are seeing if they match the scaling of the preceding one. We know this because when the East Asians were doing the absolute task or the contextually independent task, the parts of their brain that are responsible for efforting in tasks were activating. So there was more activation in the brain, there was more efforting happening when they had to do the absolute task, and there was more efforting for the American when they had to do the relative task. So the proportional scaling thing caused more effort, more activation in those parts of their brain. And then again, just interesting that the HSPs overrode this cultural difference that would normally be there. So before I go into like tips for HSPs, if you're somebody that identifies with this, I want to just talk about a couple of cultural things. So if we're in a culture that doesn't value a certain trait, then there's going to be shame associated with that trait. And it's going to be very hard to pay attention to and develop the positive qualities of that way of processing. look at the culture that you're in and see how that culture, how that family system, even your family system, responded to your own sensitivity, and then see how you are responding to that sensitivity in yourself, because the external family system will always become the internal family system until we start to reparent ourselves, until we start to break through some of these things and shift these patterns. So if you're an HSP and you have low self-esteem, look at the ways in which you were potentially not understood, the way that your processing style was not understood, and how you can start to rectify that as an adult by understanding your own way of processing. And something else that's interesting, not just culturally, but between genders. So HSP shows up equally among genders. And yet when we're testing or asking questions about HSP, men will report lower cases of sensitivity, things like that. And has a lot to do with the cultural piece of it not being so acceptable. If something's unacceptable, the person's not going to report it. So even though it affects all genders equally, the level of reporting is going to be lower, the same way that the level of reporting other types of crimes among men are also lower. And so what are some things that you can do for yourself if you are an HSP? You can journal. Journaling is a great thing to do because of how much you're processing, to really be able to get it out and through. Maybe that's verbally talking to somebody, maybe it's writing it all out. That can be helpful. Another thing is making time for decompression. If your system is highly stimulated and there's no time for decompression, then you're just going to be wound the fuck up. You're going to be like a dreidel that just dreidels yourself right off the damn table. So making time for decompression is super important. Getting enough sleep. There is also research that backs up that HSPs need more sleep because the activities that they are doing are taxing their system a little bit more. So there's a piece of research that supports this. HSPs and non-HSPs were told to look at a board that had small L's and small T's. And they were told to, I think it was pick out the L's amongst all the T's. And the letters were sideways and they were upside down and all different ways. And what they found was the HSPs were much more accurate and they were faster, but they were also more tired and emotionally and just, stimulated afterwards. So as much as you might be more accurate and more able to get that stuff done, your system also needs just as much time to really wind down. Sort of touched on it a few minutes ago where I was talking about reparenting. Reparenting is something that I think everyone should look into. But when we're talking about HSPs, looking at reparenting the parts of you that are dealing with the sensitivity, how is it being dealt with within your own system? Reparenting is something I will do a video on very, very soon, but there's a lot of resources out there to look at in the meantime. Making sure that you have some alone time can be important. Making sure that your home is comfortable and feels like a retreat. So much of the world sometimes, or people or things, if there's no safe place for us to go, then how are we going to decompress? So having those spaces that really reflect things that make you feel safe. And of course, avoiding substances like caffeine or drugs or alcohol or anything that's going to disrupt the system. There might even be a tendency with HSPs to really avoid those things because they know how much it affects their system. I know for myself, I literally cannot even drink a half a cup of coffee without zipping my way into a 9 or a 10 on the anxiety scale. So no thank you. Put your phone on Do Not Disturb. Make some art. HSPs are known for being super creative. Express this internal world and get it out there in art for us. Like, we need it. The world needs it. Trust me. That the depth of the internal world of an HSP is incredible. And so art, baby, art. Whether that's dance or movement, there's so much to be expressed and what you can feel and tap into. And ultimately, you know your system better than anyone else. And if you don't know your system very well, then let's start that journey today of getting to know your system and what works for you and what doesn't work for you. Because you're allowed to have boundaries, you're allowed to have what works for you and what doesn't, and you're allowed to have your unique way of processing information. The evolution of human consciousness absolutely depends on the diversity in perception and the integration into the structures of our society. of that information about neurodiversity. Thank you all so much for tuning in and watching. If you enjoyed this video, give it a thumbs up and subscribe to my channel. Hit the notification bell. And for those of you that don't know, I offer private sessions with individuals. I also do a monthly workshop the last day of every month and different themes each month. So if you want to look at the previous workshops that I've done, or stay tuned for next month's, you can go to my website at rowangarlow.com. Yeah, I hope everybody has a wonderful rest of their day, and thank you. See you soon.